I want to first thank all of you, and thank you, Toby, for the invitation. And thank you so much, Rick, for, I think Rick knows that he's been very inspiring. His work was very inspiring for me. And before I start this presentation, I want to thank Rick, and I want to thank, first, before I proceed, Edith Vice Professors, Edith Vice Gal and John Gal, my PhD supervisors, because everything that you are about to hear and see was done under their inspiration and guidance. So I first wanted to say that before I start. I made this presentation to allow us to take a look together on highlight findings on social workers, on Israeli social workers' engagement in policy advocacy. And the presentation is mainly focused on answering the questions of, do Israeli social workers engage in policy advocacy, and what can explain their engagement? Now, please forgive me that I don't have enough time to give you much details about the Israeli, the context of the Israeli welfare services, but I think it is very important to take into account before we dive in 3 things. First, is that most of the Israeli social welfare services are fully or partly funded by the state, by the government, that most of the services are universal, and that in the last 20 years, the services had suffered from a few rounds of service austerity measures. Now, we found that on this context, social workers are definitely not a passive entity, and they do engage in efforts to change social policy, though their level of engagement depends on their job position and the type of the organization they work for. So although their overall level of engagement in policy advocacy is low to medium, social workers holding a managerial position or supervision position, community social workers, and social workers in NGOs demonstrate higher levels of policy advocacy engagement than social workers who work in direct practice in the public local services. And consistently, Israeli social workers engage in organizational level policy advocacy more than in local and national level policy advocacy efforts. So it is actually indicated once again now in a new study with more than 2,500 social workers, Israeli social workers. And in terms of what enables them to engage, we found that their efficacy and their skills of both social workers and social work students are lower than their motivation and their interest in engaging in policy advocacy. And that tells us much about what we need to invest to enable them to fulfill this motivation. So to add to this, I just want to say one more thing that concerning the descriptive aspects of the engagement, is that from quantitative and qualitative studies, we already revealed that social workers are a very important engine in encouraging and in helping and facilitating social services users in policy advocacy efforts. This is something I think that is quite new, and not much research was done on that. So in the next question that rises from these findings is why Israeli social workers engage in policy advocacy. So one of the most important theoretical contribution of all studies that aim to explain policy advocacy is that in order to explain policy engagement, we need to utilize an integrative approach by drawing upon more than one theoretical framework. And in the next slide, I would like to show you how utilizing such approach can help us advance what we know about policy advocacy research. So this study was done under the supervision of Edith and John, and examines the relationship between organizational and personal predictors in explaining policy advocacy engagement. I don't want to repeat the civic voluntarism model assumption because Rick has spoken greatly about it, and I think he saved me some time. Thank you, Rick. So here we tested a model that used a modified organizational culture and civic voluntarism variable. I think it's quite differently from the way you use the civic voluntarism model assessments. And it used a sample of direct social workers who work in direct practice. And one of the main findings from this study is that the organization plays a dominant role in policy advocacy engagement, because you can see in the model that the organizational support in policy advocacy has significant effect on most of the predictors, with the other predictors with direct effect on the actual policy advocacy engagement. So in the next study, I wanted to test if this findings is also valid among managers in social welfare services. And in this study, I did not find big surprises, but it does emphasize that besides the dominant role of the organization, the social workers' skills, participation in voluntary activity, and their position in the organization, which are all the three of these are considered to be outcomes of political socialization, have the strongest and direct effect on policy advocacy levels. So taking into account that these three factors, skills, voluntary activity, and leadership roles, are all have much to do with childhood socialization. So can we social work educators actually have any impact on these mechanisms that fosters policy advocacy engagement? So the next study addresses exactly this question. And indeed, the evaluation that I already mentioned, it was done to evaluate the effectiveness of the policy advocacy course. And it was very effective also in showing that students related, policy related, like facilitators, the knowledge, skills, and increased significantly after the course, and that this increases had finally led to higher motivation to engage in policy advocacy. So far, in order to explain policy advocacy, we looked at the role of variables that are considered to be an outcome of political socialization in the family, later in organizations, or in social work education. So, because of this, this type of predictors are, because they are influenced much by the students' economic status and organizational culture. So therefore, they are exposed to changes over time. And personality traits, however, considered much stable and consistent patterns. So this model, the model that you see now, is an effort to test the association of personality traits and social work students' willingness to engage in policy advocacy. But still, we take into account the civic voluntarism predictors. So once again, we witness the power of skills in explaining policy advocacy related outcomes. But the new knowledge we gain from this study is that students who are higher in, they are more extroverted and open to experience, tend to demonstrate higher knowledge, skills, and interests, which later fosters their willingness to engage in policy advocacy. So we could, with the article, I give some suggestions on how to actually, this findings can be applied to practice, but I think we can easily recognize the students and maybe put them in, facilitate some specific programs with to foster the leaders, to create some leaders in the services later on during their career. So now let's zoom out and look at the context which social workers work to examine if policy advocacy engagement has anything to do with other job-related predictors, and whether policy advocacy is associated with social workers' actual perception of the quality of the services they provide. But this time, we look at policy advocacy as a predictor, not as an outcome. So to do so, we harness most novel job quality theories, especially relevant and valid in Europe. And these job quality models link social workers' job characteristics with a variety of outcomes, including their performance, service quality. And you can see here in bold the main features of job quality. But I have some bad news about it. Unfortunately, this effort to explain service quality using policy advocacy engagement with, of course, other features of their work, of social work job, was not very successful because, but you know what, I will start with the good thing. The model that you see does tell us a valid story because it reveals the relationship between core social work job characteristics, such as meaningfulness, job autonomy, and recognition, and their policy advocacy engagement. So despite the fact that the direct effect of policy advocacy on service quality was low, but it was still significant. It was low, but still significant. Still, we discovered something new. We can conclude from this study that although policy advocacy is considered to be a practice that challenges the organization, the higher social workers' engagement in policy advocacy, still they receive more prestige, more respect, and more autonomy in the organization they work for. So, and these characteristics I don't have enough time to emphasize, but these job characteristics are very important they're very important motivational aspect of social workers' performance and also social workers' well-being. So these studies they have more than one limitation, and I'm sorry that I don't have the time to address all of them, but mostly I think that what I can conclude is that to further our knowledge on policy advocacy, I think what we're missing in the research is, what do you think? This is the first question. I hope that that you maybe would like to answer. Thank you for listening so far.